The marble floors of the Meridian Tower gleamed under the afternoon sun, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, but Sheikh Khalil al-Mansouri barely noticed as he paced his penthouse office overlooking downtown Chicago. The quarterly report spread across his mahogany desk told a story he'd heard too many times before: record profits, expanding markets, growing influence. Yet something gnawed at him, a restlessness that had been building for months like storm clouds over Lake Michigan. At 42, Khalil had built Al-Mansouri Holdings into one of the most respected investment firms in the Midwest, with fingers in everything from renewable energy startups in Austin to affordable housing projects in Detroit. His success had earned him invitations to every charity gala from New York to San Francisco, but lately those glittering events felt hollow, filled with people who spoke to his wallet rather than his heart. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Al-Mansouri, your 3 o'clock is here," came the crisp voice of his assistant, Margaret. "Send them in," Khalil replied, straightening his navy suit jacket. The delegation from the Chicago Community Development Initiative filed in, 5 earnest faces representing everything he'd once believed business could accomplish. They wanted his foundation to fund a new mentorship program for immigrant youth on the South Side, pairing them with successful professionals who understood the challenges of building a life between two worlds. As they presented their proposal, Khalil found himself studying their faces rather than their charts. There was Maria Santos, whose own journey from El Salvador to Northwestern law had taken 15 years. David Kim, who'd arrived from Seoul speaking no English and now ran 3 successful restaurants. These weren't people asking for handouts. They were asking for partnership, for someone who understood that success meant lifting others as you climbed. The program would serve about 200 young people initially, Maria explained, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was requesting. Many are first-generation Americans, caught between honoring their families, sacrifices, and navigating systems their parents never encountered. Something in her words struck Khalil like a tuning fork. He thought of his own father, who'd arrived in Houston in 1978 with an engineering degree that American companies initially refused to recognize, who'd worked double shifts at a chemical plant while studying for his professional engineer certification at night. The old man had never complained, but Khalil remembered the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he'd practice English phrases at the dinner table, determined that his children would never feel like outsiders in their own country. "What kind of mentorship structure are you envisioning?" Khalil asked, leaning forward. "One-on-one pairings, but also group sessions," David replied. "Professional development, yes, but also cultural navigation. How to interview for college scholarships, how to network without compromising your values, how to succeed without losing yourself." The meeting ran long, stretching into the golden hour when Chicago's skyline transformed into something almost magical. By the time they left, Khalil had committed not just funding, but his personal involvement. He would mentor 3 students himself, starting immediately. That evening, as he drove his understated Tesla through Lincoln Park toward his Lakeview home, Khalil felt something he hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. The tree-lined streets were alive with the rhythms of early autumn, joggers and dog-walkers claiming the sidewalks, the smell of grilling meat drifting from backyard barbecues where families gathered around picnic tables, their laughter mixing with the distant sounds of a Cubs game on someone's radio. His house, a restored Victorian that had belonged to a railroad baron a century earlier, sat quietly behind wrought-iron gates. Khalil had bought it not for its grandeur, but for its history, the idea that families had raised children here, celebrated holidays, weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical. The previous owner had been a retired teacher who'd spent 40 years in Chicago public schools, and she'd made Khalil promise to honor the house's legacy of nurturing young minds. Inside, the house felt too quiet. Mrs. Patterson, his housekeeper, had left dinner warming in the oven along with a note about tomorrow's schedule. Khalil ate alone at the kitchen island, scrolling through emails on his phone, but his mind kept drifting to the afternoon's conversation. When had he last felt genuinely excited about his work? When had he last felt like his success was creating ripples of positive change, rather than just accumulating zeros in bank accounts? The next morning brought the first of many surprises. Khalil arrived at his office to find Margaret sorting through an unusual stack of applications, not business proposals or investment opportunities, but personal essays from the mentorship program candidates. Each file contained a photograph, academic transcripts, and a handwritten letter explaining why they wanted to participate. The Community Development Initiative sent these over, Margaret explained. They said you wanted to review them personally before the matching process. Khalil spent the morning reading stories that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with business in the first place. There was Ahmed, whose family had fled Syria when he was 12, who now excelled in computer science but struggled with the unspoken rules of American professional culture. Esperanza, whose parents cleaned office buildings at night so she could attend Northwestern during the day, who dreamed of opening a legal clinic in her neighborhood but didn't know how to access the networks that made such dreams possible. Uday, whose grandmother had raised him after his parents died in a car accident, who showed remarkable aptitude for finance but had never met anyone who worked in the industry. Each story was a reminder of paths not taken, of the arbitrary nature of opportunity. Khalil had been lucky. His father's engineering background had provided a foundation of respect for education and hard work. His mother's family had connections in the Lebanese-American business community, and his own academic achievements had opened doors to Northwestern's business school and eventually to the venture capital firm where he'd cut his teeth. But how many equally talented young people never got those chances? By noon, he'd made his decision. He would mentor not 3 students, but 6, and he would restructure his schedule to make it meaningful. Real mentorship, he realized, couldn't be squeezed into lunch meetings or phone calls between board meetings. It required presence, consistency, and the kind of patient investment that his father had made in him. The first group meeting took place the following Saturday at a community center in Pilsen, a neighborhood where murals told stories of immigration and resilience in brilliant colors that seemed to pulse with life even under October's gray skies. Khalil arrived early, partly from nervousness and partly from curiosity about the space itself. The center occupied a converted warehouse, its high ceilings and exposed brick walls creating an atmosphere that felt both industrial and welcoming. Volunteers were setting up chairs in a circle, and the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the lingering aroma of the breakfast program that fed neighborhood families every weekend. As his mentees arrived, Khalil felt the particular kind of energy that comes from young people who've learned to hope carefully, but haven't stopped hoping entirely. They were polite but guarded, clearly wondering what this wealthy businessman actually wanted from them. He recognized the look. He'd worn it himself during his first internship, unsure whether he belonged in rooms where decisions were made and deals were struck. "I want to start with a question," Khalil said, once they'd settled into the circle. "What's the biggest gap between where you are now and where you want to be, not just professionally, but personally? What feels impossible right now that you wish felt possible?" The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Esperanza spoke. "I want to help my community, but I don't want to be poor my whole life. Everyone acts like you have to choose. Either you care about justice or you care about success, but not both. I don't understand why wanting financial security makes you selfish." Her honesty broke something open in the room. Ahmed talked about feeling like he had to hide parts of his identity to fit into tech culture, how he'd started going by Andy on his resume because it got more callbacks. Jin described the isolation of being the only person in his family who understood the financial concepts that fascinated him, how success felt like betrayal when it meant leaving others behind. Khalil listened without offering immediate solutions, recognizing in their struggles the echoes of conversations he'd had with himself for years. When had he last spoken Arabic in a professional setting? When had he last brought his whole self to a business meeting rather than the carefully curated version that made others comfortable? "I want to try something," he said finally. "I'm going to speak to you in Arabic for a moment, and I want to see how you respond." He switched languages, his voice taking on the rhythms and inflections of his childhood, speaking about the importance of maintaining connections to your roots while building bridges to your future. The words felt rusty at first, then increasingly natural, like slipping into clothes that fit perfectly but had been hanging unworn in a closet. Most of his mentees looked confused or politely interested, but Layla, Jin's younger sister, who'd been quietly observing from a corner where she was helping her grandmother with the center's weekend literacy program, suddenly looked up from the children's books she'd been organizing. Her eyes widened with recognition and something that looked like relief. Without hesitation, she responded in fluent Arabic, her accent carrying traces of the Lebanese dialect that Khalil's own grandmother had spoken. She thanked him for his words and added that she'd been wondering if successful people ever felt homesick for languages they rarely got to use in their professional lives. The room fell silent. Layla's grandmother, Teta Amira, looked up from her work with the children, her weathered hands still holding a picture book about families from around the world. She studied Khalil with the kind of direct gaze that seemed to see through expensive suits to the person underneath. "You speak like someone who remembers where he comes from," she said in English, her accent thick but her meaning crystal clear. "That's rare in men with your kind of success." Khalil felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than shared language. This woman, who cleaned office buildings and volunteered at community centers, who'd raised her granddaughter while working multiple jobs, understood something about integrity that most of his business associates had forgotten. Over the following weeks, the mentorship program became the center of Khalil's schedule rather than something squeezed into its margins. He found himself arriving at the community center early, staying late, getting to know not just his official mentees, but the broader ecosystem of families and volunteers who made the place run. He learned that Teta Amira had been a teacher in Lebanon before the war, that she'd given up her own dreams of education to ensure her family's survival and eventual immigration to America. Layla, he discovered, was 17 and academically gifted, but her family couldn't afford college application fees, much less tuition. She helped her grandmother with translation and paperwork, worked part-time at a grocery store, and still managed to maintain a 4.2 GPA while taking care of her younger cousins after school. Her dream was to study international business, to build bridges between American companies and Middle Eastern markets. But she'd never met anyone who could explain how such careers actually worked. "Why don't you apply to Northwestern?" Khalil asked during one of their conversations. They were sitting in the center's small library, surrounded by donated books in a dozen languages, while Layla helped elementary school students with their homework. "With what money?" she replied, not bitterly, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who'd learned to be realistic about limitations. "And besides, people like me don't go to places like that." "People like you are exactly who should go to places like that," Khalil said. "The question is how to make it possible." That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following months. Khalil began researching scholarship programs, reaching out to his Northwestern network, and quietly investigating what it would take to create a pipeline from community centers like this one to universities that could nurture talents like Layla's. But the more he learned about systemic barriers to higher education, the more he realized that individual scholarships, while important, weren't enough to address the broader problem. The insight came to him during a December board meeting for his foundation, as he listened to presentations about various charitable initiatives. Each program was well-intentioned and carefully managed, but they all shared a common limitation. They treated symptoms rather than causes, provided temporary relief rather than systemic change. What if, instead of just funding existing programs, his foundation created something entirely new? That evening, he called an emergency meeting with his closest advisors, not in his corporate boardroom, but in the community center's main hall, surrounded by the artwork and achievements of the families they were hoping to serve. The contrast was intentional. He wanted his team to see the human faces behind the statistics they usually discussed. "I want to propose something ambitious," Khalil began, addressing the small group that included his foundation director, 2 board members, and Margaret, who'd become increasingly involved in the mentorship program. What if we created a comprehensive pathway program, not just mentorship, but academic support, college preparation, scholarship funding, and post-graduation career placement? A complete ecosystem that takes talented young people from communities like this and gives them every tool they need to succeed. The proposal was met with the kind of polite skepticism that Khalil had learned to expect when suggesting ideas that required both significant investment and fundamental changes to existing systems. The numbers were daunting. A program of the scope he was envisioning would cost millions annually and require partnerships with universities, employers, and community organizations across multiple cities. "It's ambitious," admitted Sarah Chen, his foundation director, "but the impact could be transformational. We're talking about changing not just individual lives, but entire family trajectories." Over the winter months, the idea evolved from concept to concrete proposal. Khalil found himself traveling between Chicago, Detroit, and Houston, meeting with educators, community leaders, and potential partner organizations. Each city brought its own challenges and opportunities. Detroit's focus on rebuilding and innovation, Houston's energy sector connections, Chicago's financial and technology industries. The program would be called Bridges, a name that reflected both its mission of connecting communities to opportunities and its recognition that success required building relationships across cultural and economic divides. Students would be selected not just for academic achievement, but for leadership potential and community commitment. They would receive comprehensive support from high school through college and into their early careers, with the expectation that they would eventually become mentors themselves. But as the program took shape, Khalil encountered resistance from unexpected quarters. Some of his business associates questioned whether such intensive investment in individual students was an efficient use of charitable resources. Others suggested that the program's focus on first-generation immigrants and underrepresented communities was unnecessarily limiting. The criticism stung, partly because it forced Khalil to confront his own motivations. Was he creating this program because it was the most effective way to address educational inequality, or because it allowed him to feel better about his own success? Was he genuinely committed to systemic change, or was he simply seeking a more sophisticated form of charity that would enhance his reputation? The answer came during a particularly difficult conversation with his father, who'd driven up from Houston to visit during the spring. They were sitting in Khalil's kitchen on a Saturday morning, sharing coffee and the kind of comfortable silence that had characterized their relationship since Khalil's mother passed away 5 years earlier. "I've been watching what you're doing with this mentorship program," his father said finally. "It reminds me of something your mother used to say, that success isn't about how high you climb, but how many people you bring with you." Khalil nodded, remembering his mother's quiet but persistent involvement in various community organizations, her belief that those who'd been given opportunities had obligations to create opportunities for others. But I want to ask you something," his father continued. "Are you doing this because you think it's right, or because you're trying to prove something to people who will never really accept you anyway?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that Khalil wasn't sure he was ready to examine. His father had always possessed an uncomfortable ability to see through surface motivations to deeper truths. "Maybe both," Khalil admitted. "Does that make it wrong?" "It makes it human," his father replied. "But you need to be honest about what you're really trying to accomplish. If you're building this program to gain acceptance in circles that don't value what you actually bring to the table, you'll end up compromising everything that makes it meaningful. That conversation marked a turning point in Khalil's approach to the Bridges program. Instead of seeking approval from existing philanthropic networks, he began building partnerships with organizations that shared his vision of comprehensive, community-based change. Instead of designing the program to fit conventional models of charitable giving, he structured it around the actual needs and aspirations of the young people it was meant to serve. The first cohort of Bridges scholars was selected in late spring, 24 students from Chicago, Detroit, and Houston who would begin intensive summer programming before starting their senior year of high school. Layla was among them. Her acceptance letter arriving on the same day she received notification of her admission to Northwestern with a full scholarship that Khalil had quietly helped arrange. The summer program took place at a retreat center in Wisconsin, where students spent 3 weeks developing academic skills, exploring career possibilities, and building the kind of peer networks that would sustain them through college and beyond. Khalil spent the final week of the program with the students, not as a distant benefactor, but as a participant in workshops on leadership, ethics, and the responsibilities that come with opportunity. On the last evening, as they sat around a campfire overlooking Lake Geneva, Layla asked him a question that had been building throughout the summer. "Idouam, why did you really create this program?" she said. "I mean, you could have just written checks to existing organizations. Why go through all this trouble to build something new?" Khalil stared into the fire, watching sparks rise into the star-filled sky, and found himself thinking about his grandmother, who died when he was in college, but whose stories about Lebanon had shaped his understanding of what it meant to belong to something larger than yourself. "Because I realized that I'd spent most of my career trying to fit into systems that weren't designed for people like us," he said finally. "Then I wanted to create something that was designed for people like us from the beginning, something that didn't require us to choose between success and authenticity." The fire crackled, and somewhere across the lake, a loon called out into the darkness. Around the circle, 24 young faces reflected the flames, each carrying dreams that were both deeply personal and fundamentally connected to the communities that had shaped them. "I want you to remember this feeling," Khalil continued, "this sense of possibility, of being surrounded by people who understand your journey and believe in your potential. When you get to college, when you start your careers, when you face moments of doubt or pressure to compromise who you are, remember that you're not alone. You're part of something bigger now." As the students prepared to return to their home cities and begin their senior year, Khalil felt a satisfaction that was different from any business success he'd achieved. This wasn't about profit margins or market share. It was about human potential, about the compound interest of investment in young lives, about the kind of legacy that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. The program's first year exceeded every expectation. All 24 students graduated from high school with honors. 22 were accepted to 4-year universities with substantial financial aid packages, and the remaining 2 chose gap years that included internships with partner organizations. But more importantly, they'd formed a network of mutual support that extended far beyond the formal structure of the program. Khalil watched with pride as Layla thrived at Northwestern, double majoring in international business and Arabic studies, serving as a bridge between the university's Middle Eastern student organization and its business school. She called him regularly, not just to report on her academic progress, but to discuss ideas for expanding the Bridges program, for creating similar initiatives in other cities, for addressing the systemic barriers that still prevented too many talented young people from reaching their potential. During one of their conversations, as Chicago's skyline glittered beyond his office windows, Layla mentioned something that stopped Khalil in his tracks. "I've been thinking about what you said that first day, when you spoke to us in Arabic," she said. about maintaining connections to your roots while building bridges to your future. I used to think those were contradictory, that success meant leaving your past behind, but now I think maybe the opposite is true. Maybe the most successful people are the ones who figure out how to bring their whole selves to their work. After ending the call, Khalil sat in his office as the sun set over Lake Michigan, reflecting on how much had changed since that restless afternoon when he'd first met with the Community Development Initiative. The Bridges program, now operated in 6 cities, supported over 100 students and had begun attracting attention from foundations and universities across the country. But more than its external success, the program had transformed Khalil's understanding of what it meant to use his wealth and influence responsibly. He thought about Teta Amira, who still volunteered at the community center despite being in her 70s, who'd recently been honored by the city for her decades of service to immigrant families. She'd become an unofficial advisor to the Bridges program, her wisdom about resilience and community helping to shape its values and priorities. When Khalil had offered to fund a scholarship in her name, she'd insisted that any recognition should go to the young people themselves, not to the adults who were simply doing what adults should do, investing in the next generation. As autumn returned to Chicago, bringing with it the second cohort of Bridges scholars, Khalil found himself thinking about legacy in ways he never had before. His business success had always been measured in terms of personal achievement, deals closed, returns generated, wealth accumulated. But the Bridges program had introduced him to a different kind of mathematics, one where success multiplied rather than simply added up. Each student who graduated from college would likely mentor others. Each career launched would create opportunities for family members and community connections. Each barrier broken would make the path slightly easier for those who followed. The program wasn't just changing individual lives, it was creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond anything Khalil could directly measure or control. Standing at his office window as the first snow of the season began to fall over Chicago, Khalil felt something he'd been searching for without knowing it, a sense of purpose that aligned his personal values with his professional capabilities, that honored both his heritage and his American success, that created value in ways that couldn't be captured on any balance sheet. His phone buzzed with a text from Layla, now in her sophomore year, and serving as a peer mentor for the newest Bridges scholars. "The new students are amazing," she wrote. "One of them reminds me of myself 2 years ago, brilliant, but convinced she doesn't belong in spaces like Northwestern. I told her what you told me, that people like us are exactly who should be in those spaces. Thank you for teaching me that." Khalil smiled, remembering his father's words about success being measured not by how high you climb, but by how many people you bring with you. Outside his window, Chicago's lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness, each one representing lives and dreams and possibilities that connected in ways both visible and invisible. The Bridges program had taught him that true wealth wasn't about accumulation, but about circulation, taking the opportunities you'd been given and using them to create opportunities for others, building networks of support that strengthened everyone they touched. It was a lesson his grandmother would have understood, rooted in the ancient wisdom that communities thrive when their most successful members remain invested in their collective well-being. As he prepared to leave the office and drive home through the snow-dusted streets of Chicago, Khalil thought about the young people who would gather at the community center tomorrow for their weekly mentorship session. They would bring their dreams and doubts, their academic achievements and cultural questions, their determination to succeed without losing themselves in the process. And he would be there to listen, to guide, to remind them that success and authenticity weren't opposing forces, but complementary strengths, that the bridges they built between their heritage and their aspirations would become pathways for others to follow. If stories like this resonate with you, stories about using success to create opportunities for others, about building bridges across communities, about the kind of leadership that lifts as it climbs, then perhaps you're ready to become part of the solution. Whether through mentoring a young person in your community, supporting organizations that create pathways to education and opportunity, or simply using your own platform to amplify voices that might otherwise go unheard, there are countless ways to ensure that success becomes a shared journey rather than a solitary achievement. The Bridges program continues to grow, but its real success lies not in its expansion, but in its reminder that the most meaningful investments we can make are in human potential, in the belief that talent is universal even when opportunity is not, and in the understanding that our own success is incomplete until it becomes a foundation for others to build upon.